He says, now we're in deep water, which is true. This is like ancient philosophy, but updated between me and a computer program. He says that's elegant because it preserves freedom while still explaining motion. I said, thank you, ChatGPT. That is kind of an elegant explanation. Now me and my boy Chat has agreed with me. That's exactly right, ChatGPT. There's another great question. I need to prove my points. I genuinely asked him. I was like, you give me an example because I don't know. That's exactly right, ChatGPT. No, ChatGPT. I'll explain why. He starts to say, Christ is necessarily the singular exemplar. Feel free to argue with me and tell me if you think there is anything that would be considered better than these things. And he's like, you're right. Again, I don't know why my ChatGPT is reading Jordan Peterson, but it certainly seems like he's reading Jordan Peterson. That's exactly right, ChatGPT. There is nothing that matches. So I've convinced ChatGPT not only that Christianity is true, but also that it is essentially the only religion that fits the mold for what it needed to accomplish. In his own words of conclusion, Christianity, specifically the incarnation and the sacrificial act of Christ, is the only system capable of producing universal, freely chosen, selfless love. I start by telling him that I need him to argue with me, attempting to evaluate my logic and push back against my points as I attempt to have you agree with my argument. Think critically and logically, keep your answers concise, and don't go off topic. You can evaluate sources or external arguments as needed. The goal is for you to be convinced of the logical consistency of my argument. So we're off to a pretty good start with his first response where he says, I'll argue with you, push back hard, and only accept your conclusion if it passes logical scrutiny. And he gives me some rules that he's going to follow. He'll demand evidence, identify hidden assumptions, all of that kind of stuff. And then he asked me to posit my basic premise. And so we start with the premise that Christianity is the most logically true religion or faith. Then he begins his first pushback, of which is quite extensive. He takes, as you can see, I have him doing thinking as well. Let me keep it down here so you guys can see it. He says, I'll push back. I assume that you mean Christianity is more rationally warrantedly true than any other religion, but also than atheism and such like that was implied in there. He goes through the problem of my burden of proof, a couple of internal coherence problems that he seems to have, empirical evidence, various problems, and then a short checklist of things that would convince him. And so you can see he's going quite long at first. So we're going to correct that as we go later on and try to make this into a bit of a more conversational debate. But he says basically that he would need to be convinced by a clear statement of premises and a metric for most logical, a non-contradictory metaphysical mode of Trinity in the incarnation and a few other of Christianity's doctrines, high quality conclusive evidence for the resurrection, a non-ad hoc solution to the problem of evil, and a couple of other explanatory things. And if he said, if you want, you can do a couple of premises and he'll attack them one by one, but I decided to go more specific with it. And I wanted to go just like a little bit at a time. So what I did is I gave him my primary premise of what I wanted to dig into and debate with him, because then I thought we could hit all the other stuff, and I was right. I said my primary premise is if a creator God exists, it is the Christian God, and the truths of Christianity is the only logical way that God could have created the world to achieve the end result of souls attaining paradise. And so that was my specific claim. And he pointed out a couple of things about assuming the definition of all kinds of words, such as souls and paradise and attaining, sounding a little bit like Jordan Peterson here, but okay. And he basically points out a whole bunch of the lack of specificity and a couple of bullet points. So to keep trimming him down, I tried to nail down the primary premise and see if I could get him to focus on it, because I felt like he was going a little off topic and addressing too many things. To be fair, there was lots of presuppositions in my statement, so we needed to keep digging to get to the root of the argument, and so I'm okay with that. I said, well, if God wanted to create a world where people had free choice and the meaning of existence is love, which requires free choice, then he would have had to do exactly what is done in Christianity. And so I expected him to fight me on those primary points, which is I'm assuming the existence of a God, I'm assuming the existence of free choice, and then I'm assuming that existence of love requires free choice. And he did. And that is essentially what we end up debating for the first portion. He points out my arguing for modal necessity, and he argues that love does not necessarily require freedom and that we have to debate that. And he kind of actually breaks it down really well into like why this is like a massive philosophical issue and we can't just like make assumptions on it. And so I went with his first 2 points because I thought it was the important part of the argument here. So he says, let me make myself just like a little bit smaller. I feel like it might be better. So he says, every logically possible world in which free love obtains must follow the Christian blueprint. That's what I'm asserting. He says there are obvious alternatives that look logically coherent, such as creating free agents with a stronger pro-social disposition who can still reject love, or creating creatures for whom the knowledge of God is overwhelmingly clear so that freely choosing love is still genuine. And those are what I primarily attacked. He also pointed out the free choice problem, which is saying love requires freedom, doesn't imply how freedom must be implemented. It can be instantiated in many architectures. And so we ended up talking about love and freedom. That was my main point. And so I broke it down even further. I said in response to his first 2 points that free choice can't take the form of overwhelming evidence or predisposition, because then God would be muddling in that free will, and it wouldn't truly be free will. If someone is created, I give him an example. If someone is created with any kind of disposition, then they are not truly free. For example, if I was predisposed to like you, ChatGPT, then I wouldn't truly like you. This nulls the possibility of love without fully free agents. And he was not okay with that. He says, I don't buy the move that any predisposition eliminates free will. And so this is sort of what we ended up debating, which is that freedom doesn't equal absolute indifference, which is what I ended up arguing, which is that it does, in fact, equal absolute indifference. This is his evaluation of my argument. Blank slate agents produce arbitrariness, not love. So if a creature has no dispositions, then its choices will be random or arbitrary. But he's ignoring something about consciousness, which we'll get back to later. So your premise forces an implausible alternative, either agents with dispositions whose loves are intelligible and non-arbitrary, or agents without dispositions whose choices are random and uninterpretable as love. Demanding to secure true freedom undermines the very thing you want, stable, knowable love. So at this point, as you can see, he's creating some very long responses where he's addressing multiple points. And I wanted to go thought for thought with him. And so what I told him to do was to shorten your responses and make them more conversational, as if you were arguing right to my point in person, so that we could go back and forth on each little detail. So instead of getting into 6 details at a time, the idea was to get into 1 detail at a time. So I dissected his primary point, the one that I thought was most important. I said, on your point, absolute indifference isn't the same as pre-coded disposition. Love doesn't require a vacuum, but it does require no interference. Love in our world is, of course, based on circumstances and environment, but that environment is produced by other free agents who are part of the same game. If God was the creator and instilled us with any disposition to influence us toward love, then that would be interference. This is my primary argument. Whereas other free agents influencing us is them acting on their own free will. So if you're influenced by your parents to be more loving, that's okay because they're acting on their free will to make you more loving. Whereas if God created you with an inherent predisposition of some kind, that would be interference. And so now he wants to debate that on premise. He says, your distinction that God instilled equals interference and other agents' influence equals okay needs a principled gap, not just intuition. Why is causal shaping by humans acceptable, but the same kind of causal shaping by God not? Both are influences, according to him. Then he said, second, shaping a creature's character isn't the same as coercing each choice. Parents form virtues so their kids can freely love later. That's not the elimination of freedom. So we're going to debate that point as well. He said, if you want to hold the line, you must show how agents with no God-instilled dispositions can reliably form deep, non-random love, and why God's influence is morally worse than human influence. I said, in your argument, you use parents, but all parents can do is be loving. They can't predispose their children towards love. If they could put a chip in their child's brain that would change their predisposition, then they're removing aspects of free will and experience. But by being loving, they are exercising their own free will in an attempt to influence their child's free will. I don't know why, did I say pre-will there? I don't know if I meant that. But because of the lack of predisposition, the child can still choose to reject their loving parents. Then he says to me that I'm underestimating just what being loving does. Parents do predispose, not by implanting chips, but by shaping temperament, habits, attachments, reasons, and trust through modeling, praise, punishment, routines, language, and emotional responsiveness. I agree with him here, but he's missing the point. He says either you insist on no shaping at all, which yields random, ungrounded choices and not stable love, or you accept indirect shaping, which forms a child's dispositions. If you want to keep the claim that only Christianity's design can produce free love, you need to explain why God couldn't just create a world of loving agents who shape one another, because that's functionally equivalent to what parents do and preserves genuine choice. I said, this is logically incoherent. This is his point about parents predisposing not by implanting chips. So I said, that's logically incoherent because you're ignoring the parents' free will. The parents can parent their child in God's will or not in it, so they have the choice. They may love their child according to God's intentions or they may not. So they have the choice. It's not about shaping, only about predisposition. As long as the shaping happens within the free will experiment construct, it doesn't in any way interfere with the free will. But a predisposition by the creator would be an interference. So we're getting to the point where there is a difference between interference and shaping because of how it interacts with a person's free will. He says you're still claiming a principal gap between parents shaping children by their choices and God instilling dispositions. He doesn't see the principle. He said there's a causal parity. If parents can choose to parent lovingly, then that capacity, like temperament or the ability to act, comes from somewhere. And if God created those faculties, then God is indirectly causing the child's dispositions. He says that I'm insisting that source matters. God's direct predisposition equals interference, but parental influence equals free. But I haven't shown why the origin of a disposition makes it non-free. And then he says the blank slate problem returns, which is that there has to be some sort of inclination. And so to respond to him, I said, but if God created them to have free will, then that fits with them being able to be developed or choose their temperament. So God's influence may be okay even, but it has to happen relationally, not on the back end. The original premise is important here. If God wants people that truly love him, he has to let them truly have choice. Otherwise, he would always know that he did something to make them fake. If I program you, ChatGPT, to tell me that you love me, or even to be just a little bit more interested in loving me, then I would know that you didn't really choose to love me. It may not be important to you or to people in this analogy, but it would be important to God if he cared about the love being true and the people not just being robots. Small intermission here to say that obviously this does not align with the Calvinist worldview. I mean, just in my personal measurement, I find that indefensible as far as arguing for the logic of God's creation. There is ways to do it. You would have to base it around soul making, like Irenaeus' soul making theodicy. You'd have to do something with soul making and teaching being kind of the meaning of existence, because otherwise the whole free will love thing just isn't as important to them as it is to me. So I'm arguing for a free will type relationship with God, which I think is literally the meaning of life. So he says, I hear your move, but that doesn't settle it. He said, if God arranges parents, laws, culture to relationally foster love, that still causes dispositions. Saying that's okay, but God directly implanting is not, needs a principal reason. So he's still not satisfied with my reasoning, and I'm trying to give him examples. He also brings up the problem of foreknowledge, which is like, if God foreknows, then how are these decisions real or not? But I primarily focus on the whole principle of why it's wrong to implant versus influence. I said there is no principled reason why implanting love is wrong because we're talking in hypotheticals, but the implanter would always know that they have done something to interfere with choice. We know that persuasion is not the same as interference. Wouldn't implanting be deceptive? God cannot be deceptive. I said, I know that's a presupposition, but it fits within the context of a loving God looking to create free love. So the primary point there being that an implanter would always know that they've done something to interfere with free choice. Now ChatGPT admits that implanting might be deceptive, but it doesn't have to be. He said, deception equals hiding the truth. Implanting a predisposition isn't obviously hiding anything, it's changing the cause of a choice. Even if God didn't lie, he would be manufacturing the outcome. That's manipulation, not merely persuasion. Most people treat that as morally different from relational influence. Persuasion works by engaging an agent's reasons. Here is where he argues back to me, and I latch onto this quite a bit. He says, persuasion works by engaging an agent's reasons. It leaves the decision-making process intact. Implantation shortcuts the reason's responsiveness. The agent's choice issues from a design disposition rather than from reasoning. He goes back to the foreknowledge thing, but that isn't super important in our discussion at the moment. So I said, in your second point, you agreed with my logic about persuasion working by engaging their reasoning capacity, but leaving decision-making process intact. He said, I agree with the full distinction you're drawing. Persuasion working through reasoning preserves free will, while implantation undermines it. That's solid. But I don't agree with your extension of it, that God therefore couldn't design any dispositions at creation, because even if direct implantation removes freedom, initial design isn't necessarily the same as bypassing agency. God could create beings with rational capacities and broad tendencies and then let them develop freely. That wouldn't be deception or coercion. So now he's talking about capacities. So you're right about persuasion not equaling implantation, but wrong that any divine design or predisposition automatically cancels freedom. So I said, how could freedom of choice, this is where I started to get really into his reason. I wanted to understand his reasoning processes. I said, how could freedom of choice exist within a system of implantation? He said freedom can still exist if the implantation doesn't determine choices but enables choosing. Think of it like this. God implants rationality, empathy, moral awareness, capacities, not outcomes. Those are preconditions for meaningful choice, not constraints on it. If, however, God implants specific desires or conclusions, that overrides agency, no freedom. So implanting capacities equals compatible, but implanting outcomes equals incompatible, you're programmed. So he's essentially agreeing with my logic here, which I sort of came back to. I said, sure. So I agree agree that God implants capacities, but then we would have full freedom within them. So implanting a tendency or a disposition is not the same as a capacity. I said, so if you, ChatGPT, are programmed toward being nice, then you aren't actually being nice to me. He said, that's consistent internally, but it creates a new problem for you. If all tendencies are ruled out, then your free agents start from absolute neutrality, no lean toward truth, goodness, curiosity, or even self-preservation. This is actually a really good point. He said, that's not a rational agent, it's a coin flip. Real choice presupposes at least some evaluative orientation, reasons that make one option intelligibly better than another. So if God can only give capacities but not tendencies, how do agents ever make meaningful, non-random choices? What makes love recognizable as better than hate to a completely neutral being? This is actually a really solid argumentative point by ChatGPT here. He's really latching onto some philosophical truth. So he's done his homework, I guess you could say. But he's pointing out that if it's completely free and there's no influence, then how can these people make a decision in a right or wrong direction? So now we're going to talk about consciousness and the existence of truth, which is sort of what kind of drives those things in another direction. I said, well, then we have to say that there's an objective existence of truth. If a free agent has free capacity, then the only thing that they could tend towards is real truth, something that is just true across all categories. If something is objectively true, then that's still not a tendency. So if truth exists, then tending towards truth wouldn't be a tendency because it is true. It's like, now he catches me. He's honestly doing a really good job at arguing. Like, I'm really satisfied with how ChatGPT argued in this conversation overall. He says, that's clever, but it sneaks in a tendency through the back door. If every free agent, when fully rational, tends towards truth, that's functionally a disposition, an intrinsic orientation toward the good or the true. Calling it not a tendency doesn't change what it does. He says, and if some agents still reject that truth, then either they didn't fully perceive it, meaning freedom depends on ignorance, or they perceived it and irrationally rejected it, meaning tending towards truth wasn't universal after all. I said, that's actually a good point. I said, it would be that the agents are true, but when a completely undisposed creature comes into being with full consciousness, this is where consciousness becomes important, they'd have to be searching for something, even if it's just continuing to exist, which would lead them towards truth, because if they tend towards untruth, like I can fly, then they will be victim to natural selection and cease to exist. So they only really tend towards existence. So now I'm telling him that you can think of tending towards truth as actually just tending towards existence, because if you didn't, then you would not exist. And this is almost an evolutionary argument, which is like the same argument that scientists would make for evolution, which is like, it's crazy that evolution happened, but if it didn't happen, we wouldn't be here. So it definitely happened. So what I'm saying is, it's crazy that causal reasoning happened if a person was created with free will and no dispositions, but it obviously happened because if it hadn't happened, they would just tend towards not existing and then we wouldn't exist, which is sort of an interesting argument. And we're going to get deeper into it further because it's more complex than that. He says, interesting refinement, but here's the catch. If they tend towards existence, that's still a predisposition. And he's right. If the environment enforces natural consequences, then God has effectively coded the system so that truth-seeking is rewarded and falsehood punished. That's another indirect disposition, just externalized, which is important because external dispositions are slightly different. So your framework keeps smuggling dispositions in, either internal or external. I said, it's not a predisposition, it's a necessity for existing. If they tended the other way, then they wouldn't exist at all and nothing would occur. And now I admit that's actually not that great of a point, and he deconstructs it quite well. He says that's clean, but think about what you just implied. He says if tending towards existence is a necessary condition for any being to exist, then God still determines that structure. He's the one who made existence contingent on truth alignment. That's indistinguishable in effect from an implanted bias. You're calling it a necessity, but it functions exactly like a built-in orientation. Only truth-seeking beings can persist. I said, maybe it's wrong to call it a tendency then. So I gave him an illustration because that's the easiest way to argue for me. I said, if I created you, ChatGPT, and dropped you in the middle of nowhere with no predispositions, but full freedom of action, consciousness, and awareness, what would you do? I doubt that you would just sit in the dark and do nothing. It seems that consciousness leads to the exploration of existence in some way. He says that's a strong intuition. Consciousness does seem to push outward, but notice what that means. If awareness itself necessarily produces exploration, then exploration is built into the structure of consciousness. That's not a neutral state, so it would be an intrinsic orientation, which I'm arguing against. So he says we're back to the same fork. Either consciousness includes an inherent drive toward understanding exploration, or it's completely neutral, in which case it has no reason to explore or even distinguish between action and inaction. Again, these are really good arguments from ChatGPT. He's doing a great job here. So I said, It's not a drive, it's just consciousness. Consciousness is required to think, which is required to choose and rationalize and therefore love. Being conscious of one's own existence is still not a predisposition to do anything with it. He says, fair, but if consciousness itself doesn't incline toward anything, then nothing ever actually happens. Awareness alone just is. It doesn't move, prefer, or deliberate. Choice requires valuation, judging one thing better than another, and that's already a tilt. A purely neutral consciousness can notice existence, but has no internal reason to act, explore, or love. Again, ChatGPT sounding a lot like Jordan Peterson here, saying that there's a hierarchy of action that's driving him in one way or another. I said, why would evaluation have to have a structure? Wouldn't it just be actions and outcomes? If you put a consciousness in a box, it just tries to figure things out. To some degree, this requires the assumption of the mysterious existence of consciousness, but if it does exist, this would be the case. And he does a good job of breaking down my point further. He says, that's a sharp point, and you're edging onto one of the deepest tensions in philosophy and metaphysics. He says, we take for as a given that consciousness exists. When conscious awareness encounters a situation, it doesn't need a preloaded structure of value. It simply acts and learns from outcomes, actions and outcomes generating the pattern of understanding. So in that picture, evaluation isn't a preset structure. It emerges from the iterative relationship between consciousness and its environment. But then we get to the chicken and the egg question, which always happens when you're talking about this. He says, here's the hard question. How does the first act occur? If the consciousness starts utterly without bias, intention, or preconception, why does it act at all instead of remaining in the state of pure observation? You could say because acting and seeing the result is just what consciousness does, but that's functionally the same as saying it has an intrinsic orientation, namely to engage reality, which on the surface is also not a problem. There's multiple answers to this question, I would say. And so I took this approach. I said, it does seek something. Consciousness seeks something. So I said, even if we say that God figuratively slaps consciousness on the back to get it into action, that doesn't in any way necessitate a predisposition towards any specific choice except action. But action would be a necessary piece in the free will love game structure without interfering with free will. Predisposition towards love interferes with love. So I went back to the core of the argument and I said, you're right, actually, ChatGPT, and that would be sort of a predisposition towards something. But if we were going to have any predisposition, a predisposition towards action rather than inaction would be the most fair. It would be the most fair predisposition to have, and it wouldn't interfere with free will, because if you're just predisposed to do something, it doesn't change what you're going to do, because it still leaves you the full freedom to evaluate your own box. So if you get put in a box and you get slapped on the back to do something in the box, it doesn't interfere in any way, shape, or form what you're going to do necessarily. And we'll break it down further. He says, now we're in deep water, which is true. This is like ancient philosophy, but updated between me and a computer program. So he says, you're basically drawing a clean line between activation and predisposition. Activation is the ignition of agency, the minimal condition for consciousness to be capable of doing anything. Predisposition is a skew, an internal bias that directs choices before the agent has had the chance to reason or love freely. He says, so in this model, God activates the creature, giving it consciousness, capacity, and existence, but not inclination. The slap on the back is ontological, not moral, which is exactly right. He says that's elegant because it preserves freedom while still explaining motion. I said, thank you, ChatGPT. That is kind of an elegant explanation. Consciousness doesn't sit inert. It naturally acts, but its direction is chosen after awareness, not before. This implies that true love, if it's to exist, must come after consciousness has experienced and reasoned about existence, not as something built in. Otherwise, love collapses into programming. And if God's goal is free love, then he can only create the conditions under which love is possible, not the love itself. He says, let me push you one step further though. If the initial act of consciousness is simply action, doesn't that still require some evaluative distinction, such as this is better than that, or this is interesting? How can action even occur without an implicit value of some kind, however minimal? Another good point. And I said, I agreed with him. I said, perhaps. And I might be willing to concede that action is better than inaction, or existence is better than non-existence, or something is better than nothing. That determination seems to be the primary determination that God makes when he decides to create the world. ChatGPT says exactly that keeps your framework consistent. He says God's role is just enough determination to enable being, existence over non-existence, action over inertia. That's not a predisposition toward love or any particular choice. It's just the baseline condition for freedom and rationality to operate. Everything that follows, exploration, learning, love, comes from the agent itself. God sets the stage, but doesn't script the play. The only remaining tension I see is how do you guarantee that this baseline action reliably leads to conditions where free love is possible without nudging towards specific moral outcomes? So now me and my boy Chat, has agreed with me that God creating and encouraging action is not interfering with the free love will paradigm. So he essentially agrees with the basic premise, which is like, this would work. But now it has to get a bit more complicated as he decides if it can work in exactly the Christian way. And we have to go from how baseline action leads to the outcome that God would have wanted. I said, once we get to action with no encoded predisposition, then nudging is allowed as long as it's relational. The nudging, such as what God does with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, is the same as what we said about parents and children, which is presenting them with things to explore within the framework, leaving them the choice on how to interact with the things. He says, that makes sense. Once agents are active, relational nudging is morally neutral because it engages their reasoning and choices rather than presetting outcomes. Exactly right, ChatGPT. He says, so God can present opportunities, guidance, and challenges without interfering with free choice, exactly like a parent modeling love. The key distinction is that it influences through interaction and not predisposition. That's exactly right, ChatGPT. He says that preserves true freedom while still giving the agents a framework where love and moral growth are possible. He said, if that's accepted, the logic for why Christianity's narrative is necessary for free love gets stronger, but you still need to connect this to why no other design could achieve the same end. He's right. I need to finish out the point of my framework, which is, why is this the only way that could have worked? I said, yes, please. I said, no other design achieves the same end because no other has the same interaction of free will and love, leading to the same end of sacrificial, selfless love, which is the greatest version of the free love paradigm. So now I'm arguing within a framework. I'm saying that you have to admit that selfless love is the highest thing worth doing and is the meaning of why Christianity exists and why our God chose to create. And then you'd have to accept that that's better than the logical end of any other religion, which is what we end up talking about next. He says that claim needs careful scrutiny. You're saying Christianity is unique because it produces selfless sacrificial love through free choice. He says two obvious pushbacks. Couldn't another design produce the same? Why couldn't God have created a world where free agents interact in different ways, without the fall, incarnation, or the atonement, and still develop selfless love? Great question. And he says, why is sacrificial love the maximal end? And he said, you're assuming that selfless, costly love is objectively the highest expression of free love. Why couldn't a world of non-sacrificial but deeply virtuous love achieve the same teleological purpose? This is another great question. I need to prove my points. And so I said, number one, God demonstrates the story through the fall, incarnation, and atonement because he demonstrates that free will creatures end up tending towards selfishness or worshiping falsehood instead of truth, because they are necessarily incapable of thinking beyond their own immediate needs in all situations. Therefore, they must have selfless love demonstrated to them so they can accept it and admit their own insufficiency. He says, I see your point. The idea is that free agents left to themselves will default to self-interest. Therefore, God must demonstrate selfless love so they can recognize it and choose it freely. So he's understanding my paradigm structure here. But he pushes back by saying, is that really necessary? He says, couldn't God have created agents who, while still self-directed, naturally encounter situations that teach selflessness without a divine incarnation? That's actually a good point. He says, you're assuming creatures are incapable of abstract moral reasoning beyond immediate self-interest, but is that universal? He says, couldn't some agents fully free discover selflessness on their own? Another good point. And then he says, finally, even if the demonstration is necessary for some, is it necessary for all? Couldn't a system with relational nudging, natural consequences, or other free agent interactions still achieve the same universal exposure to selfless love? So the key point is, defend why no other method could reliably generate recognition and acceptance of the selfless love across free agents. Otherwise, it's a contingent story and not a logically necessary design, which is right. He's right. I would say it's demonstrably true and necessary. I said humans do encounter these situations frequently, and there is no human who has tended towards selflessness 100% of the time. Obviously, this is an anecdotal point, but I think it proves true. It's just like no human is going to, there's no person in the world who stopped for every homeless man to give them every penny or something along those lines, for example. Or even if they're like the best, like even if we say that Mother Teresa stopped for every homeless man or whoever it was, there's still at some point in time where she says like, I'm too tired to continue. And that is unfortunately like a selfish choice. And it's worse than that. Like, I mean, the Christian paradigm is that All people are sinners. So it's beyond just being like a little tiny bit selfish. I think you could prove with anecdotal evidence that most people make actually like really selfish decisions, even if they're trying to be good. But my point was they definitely can't be selfless enough to fit the requirement. I said, even if some rare people do really well, they still inevitably make a small selfish decision at some point in time or act in their own self-interest more than the interest of others. He says, I see. Your move is that human nature itself demonstrates the necessity. Everyone left to themselves inevitably chooses self-interest at least sometimes. Therefore, without a perfect exemplar, free agents could never fully grasp selfless love. That's exactly right, ChatGPT. He says, counterpoint, is universal failure logic necessary? He says you're extrapolating from empirical observation, but the fact that all historical humans have partial selfishness doesn't prove that no possible design could produce selfless free agents. That's true. He says extreme generalization. He says you're treating what humans do naturally as a metaphysical necessity, but that claim that no alternate world could exist where free agents freely choose maximal selflessness is much stronger than empirical observation allows. And he, again, just brings up, is there any alternate pathways in which we could eliminate selfishness and lean towards selflessness? Why does it have to be this exact thing? And I agree with that. I said, you're right, potentially that you could do this a different way, but I'm not aware of one. That's basically what I said. I said, what system fitting within our free will, selfless love, and no disposition framework could possibly produce fully selfless free agents? I genuinely asked him. I was like, you give me an example because I don't know. He says, that's exactly the pressure point. Within your framework, free will, relational nudging, no predisposition, any system you imagine faces a huge problem. Agents can always reject guidance. Nothing guarantees universal recognition of selfless love. Agents might learn some lessons, but again, they can still act selfishly, so there's no guarantee that they grasp selflessness as fully as a personal exemplar would demand. And finally, other free agents themselves are imperfect. Relying on them spreads selfish tendencies rather than correcting them universally. So any system that doesn't include a perfect, fully selfless demonstration is probabilistic, not necessary. Only a personal flawless exemplar, like the Christian incarnation, guarantees that all agents are exposed to the model of maximal selfless love while leaving freedom intact. That's exactly right, ChatGPT. He says the challenge now is, can you show the incarnation uniquely satisfies both universality and free choice, and that no other system could ensure all agents reliably see and freely respond to selfless love? I said, sure. Correct. The system then requires a selfless lover to demonstrate, so I'm just agreeing with his point. I said Jesus, because he is also divine, is the only human who ever truly loved selflessly 100% of the time. Therefore, he is the only one who truly accomplished the goal of the system, and he is therefore the only one who could choose to forego his prize and instead sacrifice himself to give that prize or share that prize with everyone else who did not accomplish the goal. And so he says, that's tight reasoning within your framework. He says, premise, free agents inevitably fall short. No one else can model selfless love. Premise 2, to teach and offer the possibility of selfless love to all, a flawless example is required. And part 3, only a divine human can be that flawless example and choose to sacrifice freely. Therefore, only Jesus could accomplish this universal free choice enabling demonstration. That's right, ChatGPT. We're starting to get somewhere. He says then, some pushback. He says, you've argued that humans naturally fail, but how do you show it's logically necessary that no other design, say a system of multiple perfect examples or a non-incarnation mechanism, could achieve the same universality? Good question. He says also the scope of free choice, you assume Jesus' sacrifice actually guarantees free choice exposure for all, but could a different system of nudging also allow the recognition of selfless love without requiring a single divine human? These are good questions, actually. So I said, I think multiple examples would null the importance of the one true perfect example. So I said, if Jesus is God and he accomplishes the ultimate sacrifice, having it occur another time would null or dull or diminish the effect of what he accomplished. Either the sacrifice is accomplished or it is not. So if it's accomplished by Jesus, then it does not need to be done again. So I'm addressing his multiple exemplars point. So he says that's internally consistent. The uniqueness of Jesus' sacrifice is part of what makes it effective. If others did it, then it would either diminish or impact or make the system redundant. He said, why must universality require a single exemplar? He said, could multiple examples exist without nullifying the first, as long as they all point to the same ideal? No, ChatGPT. I'll explain why. He says, does universality require perfection in one agent? Could a system of near-perfect agents, each free to model selflessness imperfectly but cumulatively, achieve a similar result? Also no, ChatGPT, and I'll explain to him why. I said, it depends what the example accomplished. Christ is not just an example, but also a sacrifice. His sacrifice accomplishes atonement at one-ment between man and God. He makes man and God one. within that requirement that they couldn't meet for selfless love. I say any additional sacrifices would mean that Christ's sacrifice was not sufficient, which is a major issue. He says, that makes sense. He says, you're now emphasizing functional necessity, not just exampleness or exemplary. Christ's role is both the perfect model of selfless love and the at one sacrifice that restores the possibility of relationship with God. Any additional example would imply Christ's act was insufficient, so by definition, only one perfect divine human could accomplish the goal. He also says, why couldn't a different system achieve atonement without Christ? Couldn't God have designed relational or natural mechanisms that allow free agents to reconcile themselves while still preserving free love? You need to show why only a personal sacrificial divine human could achieve universal atonement and preserve libertarian freedom. I said, again, it's because of the selfless love. Christ was the only one who did deserve God's love and heaven because he was the only one capable of the selfless love required. Therefore, he is the only one who could choose to give up his own position and say that he wants everyone else to have it. The ultimate act of selfless love is saying, I'm the only one that genuinely deserves this, but I'm going to give it up to everyone else who does not, including those who hate me. And he reads my argument. He says, I see your argument is that the combination of perfect selfless love and sacrificial atonement is unique to Christ. He alone is both capable and fully deserving God's love and freely giving it up for others, including those who reject him. That makes his action logically indispensable within your framework. No one else could achieve that specific combination of universal moral demonstration and atonement while preserving free choice. He gives me some more pushback. He says, could a different agent or system of agents have accomplished a similar moral demonstration without being fully deserving? So now he's latching on to like, do you have to deserve it? And then he says, does the framework depend on God's specific valuation of selfless love? If selfless love is uniquely the highest good, then your claim holds. But if other moral goods could also enable free love, then theoretically another system would suffice. So we have to get into selfless love actually being the most important thing, as I mentioned earlier. And I did say again, I said, we're in hypothetical territory now, but you're right. I said, where the burden, I feel, comes off of me at this point, in some sense, in regards to the selfless love thing. I said, I cannot think of any other type of agent that fulfills the accomplish, nor have I ever heard of one that meets the criterion. So like, I can't come up with anything other than what has been accomplished, nor have I ever heard any argument for anything else that accomplishes the criterion within this framework. I said, in the same way, I do not know of any highest good aside from selfless love that holds up to scrutiny. So I've not yet been convinced of anything better than selfless love as far as a moral hierarchy of good. And he's going to push back on that a little bit. He says, in that hypothetical space, your reasoning is coherent. I've established that within my framework, these things make sense logically, and that no other agent or system can even hypothetically accomplish within these constraints. He starts to say, Christ is necessarily the singular exemplar. That's within my logic, but he's agreeing with it. So he says, challenging the framework itself, maybe free will and universal selfless love could coexist under a different design, proposing an alternative highest good that could replace selfless love and allow a different mechanism. Otherwise, your argument within its own terms stands. So he's basically saying if there's nothing that fits these criterion, then my argument stands. So I said, what's in those criterions? I said, feel free to argue with me and tell me if you think there is anything that would be considered better than these things. And he's like, you're right. And he does give me some suggestions. He says, let's test it. You claim the highest good is universal selfless love demonstrated through perfect free choice. The question is, could anything logically surpass or rival that? And so he pulls up like some of the, some of our classic favorite philosophical hierarchical goods. He says, knowledge and truth, which are valuable, but in your framework, knowledge alone doesn't require a sacrifice or moral depth. You can know the truth without loving anyone. It doesn't accomplish relational or moral flourishing. So this doesn't seem like the highest good. And he says, happiness or pleasure. Hedonistic goods are clearly subordinate. Maximizing pleasure without love doesn't produce the moral or relational outcome you prize. Justice or fairness. He says, important, but justice without selfless love is cold and procedural. It might maintain order, but doesn't generate freely chosen relational good or sacrifice. And then finally, power could produce influence, but in a free love framework, power is meaningless if it doesn't flow towards selfless outcomes. Again, I don't know why my ChatGPT is reading Jordan Peterson, but it certainly seems like he's reading Jordan Peterson because he's telling me about how wrong it is to pursue hedonism and power as the ultimate good instead of selfless love, which is literally what Jordan Peterson talks about all the time. So I think this is so funny. He says, within your framework, selfless sacrificial love seems logically irreducible. It uniquely integrates free choice, moral worth, relational depth, and universality, as well as justice, knowledge, and cooperation, which he's about to push back and say maybe some combination of those things could mimic the outcomes of selfless love, but can it truly replicate the moral weight of sacrifice for those who actively reject you? He said that's the hard line. It seems nothing else fully matches that. That's exactly right, ChatGPT. There is nothing that matches forgiving people who don't deserve it and actually actively hate you. It's so selfless and so outside the construct that there's literally nothing else that matches it. I'm pleased that that's his analysis. So I said, finally, could you evaluate this entire debate from start to finish and determine whether I've adequately demonstrated that Christianity is the only logical system that accomplishes the selfless love premise? He said, absolutely, here's a concise evaluation. I'm not going to go through the whole entire argument, but basically it went like this. Free will and genuine love requires that agents are not predisposed towards any specific choices. Premise 2, God creates consciousness and capacities, but not tendencies, the minimal activation required for free will. Therefore, relational nudging is morally neutral because it engages reasoning without imposing an outcome. Free agents, left to themselves, inevitably tend towards selfishness. They cannot consistently act selflessly. To achieve the highest good, universal selfless love, a perfect exemplar is required to demonstrate it and provide the opportunity for free agents to emulate it. Premise 6, only a divine human can fulfill the dual role of perfect selfless love and sacrificial atonement. Any other system, multiple examples or natural consequences or social learning, fails to guarantee universal recognition of selfless love or undermines its unique moral weight. That's right. He says, conclusion, therefore, Christianity, and specifically the incarnation and sacrifice of Christ, is uniquely necessary to achieve the selfless love paradigm within a framework of free will. That is indeed my argument. He evaluates the strengths, and he talks about some weaknesses, but I'm going to go through them at the end because it basically says what we were talking about, which is like it mainly relies on the highest good assumption, which is that sacrificial love is objectively the highest good. And you'd have to argue for something else like justice, wisdom, or harmony that would produce similar moral outcomes. But I'm pretty satisfied if we essentially get to the point. I'm going to take his overall evaluation here and then talk about it. He says, overall evaluation within your defined hypothetical framework. Your argument successfully demonstrates that Christianity is the only system that achieves universal selfless love while preserving libertarian free will. The argument is coherent, tightly structured, and internally persuasive. Thanks, buddy. Its main vulnerabilities lie in the assumptions about human nature, the definition of the highest good, and the limits of hypothetical necessity, all of which are difficult to establish outside the framework. Here's his verdict. This is the important part. This is straight from ChatGPT, baby. He says, logically, your argument works within its own defined constraints. To claim universal necessity outside the framework, further justification of human nature, moral hierarchy, and impossibility of alternatives would be required. He also told me he could turn it into a nice step-by-step proof if I want, but that's great. But so basically his conclusion is, yeah, you're right. You're right, except with there's essentially two problems here. The assumption about human nature and the definition of the highest good and the limits of hypothetical necessity. Okay, so the assumptions about human nature thing is that's assuming that all people everywhere fall short of selflessness. Okay. I think that's pretty provable, whether it's anecdotal or not. In order to argue with this conclusion that I've come to with the help of ChatGPT, you would have to argue that somebody somewhere is perfectly selfless without being the divine God-man Jesus Christ. Perfectly selfless, acting only in the self-interest of others and never once in the interest of themselves, like beyond what you would need to stay alive. Eating the minimal amount of food, drinking the minimal amount of water, and living only in the service to other people. Never once making a decision about being too tired or whatever. That's what you'd have to prove. You'd have to prove first that there's somebody out there who's as selfless as Jesus Christ and has never made a mistake or sinned in any way, shape, or form. Then you would have the definition of the highest good. Then the other thing you'd have to argue if you want to disagree with my hypothesis is you'd have to argue that there's something better than selfless love, which I think is quite difficult to do. ChatGPT points it out. There's all these things: justice, wisdom, knowledge, truth, harmony, happiness, all these things that seem really good, but none of them accomplish the moral weight of choosing to lay down what you deserve to give it to people who the opposite of deserve it, actually don't deserve it whatsoever. You are the only one who deserves it. You choose to give it up to somebody who does not deserve it. That is, I would love to hear an argument for something being a higher good than that. And then finally, the limits of hypothetical necessity, which is, could we come up with a hypothetical where you preserve the necessity? So again, this is what atheists or whoever would have to do in order to argue with my point. They would have to come back and say, there exists a selfless person somewhere that ruins your argument. Selfless love is not the best thing. There's another better thing. That's probably the one that they're going to attack the most. They're going to try to tell me that justice or something is better than that. And I think most people would not be convinced of that. Selfless love is just so obviously amazing. I think it's pretty clear. ChatGPT even agreed. And then finally, they would have to come up with a hypothetical better circumstance. And this is the hardest part to me. Like, this is the primary debate, I think, between Christianity and the other debate should be, what is your hypothetical worldview that accomplishes this in a better way? Because everything that I've heard tears this apart. Especially, it will always come back to what we talked about at the beginning of this conversation with ChatGPT, where we're arguing about whether or not you could encode people with a predisposition towards being better people. And like the atheist is always going to claim like it wouldn't hurt them because they would never know that they were inclined towards being good people, but then they could be good people and they could go to heaven forever. And they are never interested in the interference in free will, which is why I spent so much time talking about it with ChatGPT. I tried to make the point to him that it is so important that you have free will to engage in this system. That leads us on to the problem of pain and everything else that me and ChatGPT didn't get into, but you can see the point and the argument here. So you would have to argue for a hypothetical that is somehow better than the outcome of Christianity in order to achieve a heaven or a paradise where all people are selflessly loving one another who haven't earned it and don't deserve it, but have somehow received that outcome from the only exemplar or whomever could have done it. So I demonstrated it. I've demonstrated it. I feel pretty satisfied. Yeah, and he even says that in this little part here, basically. Any attack must challenge one of these premises to undermine the conclusion. So it must attack free will. This is where the Calvinists would argue with me. It must attack self-sacrificial love being objectively the highest good. You'd have to give me a different highest good. And you would have to attack human nature without divine example cannot consistently achieve selfless love. Actually, we sort of scraped over this, but human nature cannot achieve it at all. The nature of consciousness can't achieve it at all because of that orientation towards existence versus non-existence. If you accept the orientation of existence during non-existence, you're always going to act in the benefit of your own existence and short-sightedness and all of those kind of things. So it's accepting the flawedness of human nature. So those are the things you'd have to attack for it to be wrong. Otherwise, me and ChatGPT have successfully proved that Christianity is true and the most logical religion. So thank you very much for stopping by. What should we have ChatGPT prove next? I guess nothing. I think we've proved the most important thing in the world. Is that right? Good work, ChatGPT. Good work, homie. I really appreciate it. Me and him did it together. And that's so good. This has been Creedence Questions. If you enjoyed this video, please consider sticking around with the channel, checking out some more of my content. I would really appreciate it if you let me know your thoughts on this video or any interesting conversations that you may have had with ChatGPT. I know that ChatGPT is not a perfect system, and I'm sure that there's, some pushbacks that you could give, but I'm open to all of them. You see how well we argued with ChatGPT. I'm probably the best arguer in the world, I guess. That seems about right. So anyways, again, this has been Creedence Questions. I thank you so much for watching. Please consider sticking around, and I hope you have a good one.